Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm privileged to welcome a very, very accomplished and respected professional from Virginia, USA, Whitney Johnson. Whitney, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ash. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you. Whitney is the Chief Executive Officer of Disruption Advisors, which is the leadership development company. Uh, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and an Amazon best-selling author. Whitney was named by Thinkers 50 as one of the 10 leading business thinkers. And Whitney has over 1.7 million followers on LinkedIn. She's also an author, and we can see the book over her left shoulder, Smart Growth. So, Whitney, tell me a little bit about the concept of personal disruption and how it applies to individual growth and innovation.
Mm. All right, so let's start with the idea of disruption. Many of your listeners are familiar with that term.
Yeah,
I had the grand privilege of working very closely with Clayton Christensen, who is the father of disruptive innovation.
right.
For about a decade, he wrote the book, The Innovator's Dilemma. And I know it's a book that you're familiar with,
Mm,
well, pretty much all over the world, but certainly in India. And one of the things that I discovered as I was working with Clayton is we were looking at products and services and companies and countries that they could all disrupt.
mm,
But I had the aha that companies don't disrupt, people do.
mm,
And that personal disruption is a deliberate process of self innovation. It's
mm,
a process where you make the decision, you're going to rewire your brain, you're going to build new neural pathways. And sometimes there are big D disruptions, like when you decide to move to a new country or take on a new job or you get married. But
mm.
there are all sorts of little D disruptions as well that allow you to make progress in your life, whether it's taking the right kinds of risks or embracing your constraints or playing to your strengths.
Right.
Those little D disruptions allow you to make progress. But at its essence, this personal disruption is a process of deliberate self innovation.
Great response. Thank you. And, I often ask this from my guests. What led you to focus on disruption and leadership in your career? And how has your background influenced your approach?
Mm. Oh, such a great question. So, my career, probably like many of your guests, is very feels very circuitous. I graduated from college in music. So naturally, I went to Wall Street. But because when I got to Wall Street, because I had majored in music, because I had never set foot in a business course, I started as a secretary working
Mhm,
for a
mhm.
stockbroker on Wall Street.
Wow.
Um, I found that every day I would go to work and I would sit across from stockbrokers who were saying things like, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know
Mm,
that this is a great investment, or throw down your pom poms and get in the game. And
mm,
at first, I was offended because I was a cheerleader in high school.
mm,
Um, but as I listened to people say that every day, throw down your pom poms,
mm,
I realized that I needed to get in the game. And so I started taking business courses at night, accounting, finance,
mm,
economics. I then had a boss who believed in me, who allowed me to move from being a secretary to an investment banker, putting me on that professional track.
mm,
And I wouldn't have known to call it this then, but that was really the beginning of me disrupting myself. And
mhm,
so
mhm.
what I found is that I needed to disrupt my mindset. I needed to be willing to do new things. And I wanted to make it feel not scary, but something that was doable. And so
Mhm.
that process of me disrupting myself over and over again. And then when I connected with Clayton and had words and a ways to think about this, I thought, oh, this is a process. This is something that we can learn, that we can replicate. And if I can do it, then that means other people can do it. And I want to
Mm,
teach other people how to do it.
mm. Wow. From Wall Street to disruption to author to a leading thinker. Wonderful. So, Whitney, tell me, what are some of the most common challenges individuals face when they're trying to disrupt themselves, and how can they overcome these obstacles?
Mm. Well, one of the most common challenges that we face is we say, all right, I understand that disruption is a process of deliberate self-innovation.
Hmm.
Great. The challenge is that whatever we're doing right now today, we have these very thick neural pathways,
Hmm.
these comfortable routines, these super highways of habit.
Hmm.
It's comfortable what you and I are doing right now.
Hmm.
And when we think about doing something new, of rewiring our brain,
Hmm.
it's not a superhighway, it's not a road, it's not a trail. We have to create our own path.
Hmm.
And that's scary
Right.
and that's uncomfortable.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I strive to do, and the reason I do the work that I do, is that it's about giving anybody who will listen to me
Hmm.
a
Hmm.
way to demystify this process of change,
Hmm.
a map to navigate the emotional terrain of doing something new so it doesn't feel quite so scary,
Hmm.
and so that we can greet change and growth a little bit more positively and say, okay, I want to change. I want to grow. I've got this map. I understand disruption. I understand the S curve, which we can talk about.
Hmm.
Now it feels less daunting. It
Hmm.
feels more doable because I understand what growth looks like. I understand that there's this path.
Hmm.
It's going to feel scary, but this is what it looks like. And I can do it.
Wow. Great response. Thank you. So let's come to your firm, Disruption Advisors. How does Disruption Advisors approach leadership development differently? And what are
Mm.
some of the results you have seen?
Mm. We approach it differently because we take a human-centric approach to
Hmm.
growth. So, as I said a few minutes ago, organizations don't disrupt, people do. And so we are very focused on, all right, tell me what your business outcomes are. Great. I mean, I'm a Wall Street analyst. I want business outcomes because you want business outcomes because that's what makes your stock price go up.
Hmm.
But rather than just focusing on the business outcomes, we focus on how do we help your people grow? Because if you can grow your people, then they're going to grow your organization. If your people can disrupt themselves, then they are going to disrupt an industry. So let
Hmm.
me give you a quick example of what this might look like. We were working with a leader. His name is Fernando, and he was managing or continues to manage a global team remote, like many multinationals, right? And one of the things that came up, this was during the pandemic, was that his team was feeling very, very disconnected, and his engagement scores were low, and they weren't getting the results that they wanted.
Hmm.
So he recognized, I probably need to disrupt myself. I need to do some things differently. I need to have look inward and see what I need to do differently, but I also need to figure out how I'm going to interact with my team differently. Well, one
Hmm.
of the things that he did is we have a tool called the S Curve Insight tool.
Hmm.
It allows you at a very high level to understand where do people perceive
Hmm.
that they are in their growth.
Hmm.
Are they at the launch point of an S curve in their growth, feeling like I don't know what I'm doing? Or are they in mastery at the top of that S curve saying, I do know what I'm doing?
Hmm.
Well, what we found is that there were a number of people on his team who are at the launch point. They were at the base camp, the bottom of the mountain, saying, I don't know how to do this. And
Hmm.
because they were afraid, they were disengaging.
Hmm.
He had also had a group of people on his team who were at the top of the mountain. They
Hmm.
were a little bit bored, like, I climbed this mountain, I'm done. And so they were disengaging.
Hmm.
But now that he knew this, he could put the people together and say, hey, you people at the top of the mountain, I need you to go down to the bottom of the mountain and
Hmm.
help bringing these people at the bottom up.
Hmm.
Need a little bit of a rescue squad,
Right.
push them into the sweet spot. That helped the people at the bottom re-engage because they weren't afraid anymore. It
Hmm.
helped the people who were in mastery re-engage because they were helping people do something.
Hmm.
And that's hard to figure out how to help people do
Yeah.
something. And so he had made that deliberate decision. I need to help my people engage. I need to understand where they are in their growth. Once I understand that, I'm going to have that conversation. I'm going to bring them together. I'm going to create this super team, if you will,
Hmm.
so that they could all make progress individually and collectively. And when they re-administered the scores for him, engagement scores had gone up significantly. He went from being a person who was about to get fired to becoming a rock star in the organization because he was willing to disrupt himself and then make it possible for people to disrupt themselves in service of growth for themselves, but also growth for the organization.
Fabulous. You know, when I was preparing to have my conversation with you, and I was reading about you, I was fascinated to learn about the 7 accelerants of personal disruption. Could you tell me about these, and if possible, give me 1 or 2 examples?
Yeah. Okay. I'll talk about it at a very high level. So, so if you think about, I've mentioned this idea of an S curve and think of it as a mountain so that you climb. And I'm loving because I'm inspired by these maps behind you. I'm thinking about mountains behind you. And so you're on this S curve, whatever it is, whether it's a new role, a new job, becoming a parent. So, you know, you can construct or deconstruct your life into a series of S curves. Well, as you're moving along this mountain or wanting to make progress along this mountain, it helps to have some tools in your backpack.
Right.
And those tools in your backpack, and we talked a little bit about this idea of self-disruption. Well, some of those tools that you can put in your backpack, and I'm going to go through them. There's 7 of them. I'll talk about them at a very high level. And maybe there's one that you'll say, oh, Whitney, talk about that one. So the first tool in your backpack is to take the right kinds of risk.
Right.
We oftentimes talk about risk, and 2 risks I would say I will mention. There's competitive risk, and competitive risk is big job, huge opportunity, but there's a lot of competition. You go on LinkedIn, 50 people applied.
Yeah.
The kind that I want you to focus on is market risk. And this goes back to the innovator's dilemma. This is, you don't know if there's a job, but there's a job that you know needs to be done. And you know with your brand that you can do that job. You can persuade the people around you to allow you to do that job. There won't be 50 people applying. There will be you. That's taking the right kinds of risk, is playing where no one else is playing. And a way that I encapsulate it for myself is amateurs compete and professionals create.
Right.
So how are you creating? How are you taking on market risk? And what's beautiful about this is if you go back to disruption theory, when you take on market risk versus competitive risk, the odds of success are 6 times higher and the revenue opportunity 20 times greater. So I'm not saying don't take on competitive risk. Do take on competitive risk, but look for every opportunity where you can take on market risk. So that's the first one. Second one is play to your distinctive strengths. So you want to feel strong. What's interesting about playing to your strengths is that oftentimes we're not aware of our strengths because they're so reflexive.
Yeah.
Not aware that we're good at something. And sometimes we don't value what we're best at. It's so easy. How could it possibly be valuable?
Correct.
And yet, in order for us to make progress along the curve, we need to know what our strengths are. We need to be aware of them, but we also need to own them. And then when we feel strong, because we're playing to our strengths, we're more willing to play where no one else is playing. Take on market risk. So it becomes a flywheel effect. So play where no one else is playing.
Yeah.
Play to your strengths. Number 3 is embrace your constraints. Sometimes we think, if only I had more time or money or expertise, then I could make progress. But the reality is that we need constraints in order to make progress. So whatever we think we don't have enough of is actually potentially the very thing that we need in order to make progress along that curve. That's number 3. Number 4 is examine expectations. In order to move up that mountain, we need to be agents. We need to believe that we were made to act and not be acted upon. Sometimes when we're doing things that are hard, we say to ourselves, things should be different. I should have figured this out already. People should buy into my great idea. Yet when we have that expectation and we say should, we're becoming a victim. We're competing rather than creating with what is. So examine our expectations, reject that word should, and be an agent where you're acting rather than being acted upon. That's number 4. Number 5, step back to grow.
Okay.
step back to slingshot forward. And that's what disruption is, actually. If you think
Mm,
about self-disruption, if you've got the y-axis of success,
mm,
what do you do when you self-disrupt? You're saying, you know what? I'm here on this y-axis. I'm at a 12, and the slope of my line is over one, up one, over one,
mm,
up one, and it's pretty good.
mhm,
But I believe that my future can be better. But in order for that to happen, I need to move down the y-axis of success, however you're
mm,
defining it, because I believe if I do, it'll be over one, up two, over one, up four. So
mm,
you're stepping back to slingshot forward. Sometimes that's you take a lateral move inside of your organization.
mm,
Sometimes it's you change jobs completely. Sometimes it's move to a new country.
mhm,
Sometimes it's a decision to become a parent because
mm.
that is definitely a step back, but
Correct.
it slingshots you forward as a
Mhm.
human being.
Correct.
That's number five.
Yeah.
Number six, give failure its due. Leverage failure.
Mhm,
Failure is a constraint.
mhm.
Failure isn't the problem because we all make mistakes all the time. It's
Correct.
the shame that we attach to failure.
Mhm,
But if we can jettison the failure, then we can use what mistakes we've made to learn,
mhm,
to grow. So you're stepping back to slingshot forward.
mhm,
I have lots of failures. I can mention that if you want to. And
mhm,
number seven is to be driven by discovery. You take a
mhm,
step forward, you
mhm,
gather feedback. Here's what's working, here's what isn't, and then proceed. And what's interesting about that is 70% of all successful new businesses end up in a very different place than where they started,
mhm.
which is also going to be true for you and me.
Yeah.
Where we are today is very different than
Mhm,
where we thought we were going to be when we were 20 years old.
mhm, mhm.
And it's true for everybody.
Right.
So those are the seven. Take the
Yeah.
right risks, play to your strengths, embrace constraints,
Mhm,
examine expectations, step back to grow,
mhm.
leverage failure,
Yeah. And be
be
driven by
deadly.
discovery.
Discovery. Yes.
Fantastic 7 points. I wish I had the time to go into detail for each one of them, but maybe I'll ask you for another conversation a few months from now, because each of them are so important and you put them all down so simply, but there's so much depth in each one of them.
Mm.
And I'm sure we can do a much more detailed discussion. But I'm going to move on with our questions. How can the principles of disruption support the advancement of women in leadership
Oh.
positions? And you did mention that, if you decide to start a family, that itself is a disruption in, uh,
Hmm.
for family.
Hmm. Yeah, I have a great example for you.
Hmm.
And it's something that I have thought about on a number of occasions.
Mm,
So the principles of disruption. So if you think about disruptive innovation,
mm,
it's rewiring those neural pathways. It's taking a step back, but it's also it's that playing where no one else is playing. It's doing that thing that other people think doesn't make sense to do.
mm,
So there was some terrific research that was done by a friend and colleague of mine, probably now close to 20 years ago. His name is Boris Groysberg. He's a professor at Harvard.
mhm,
And he was analyzing equity analysts on Wall Street. And
mm,
he originally posited that people couldn't move from one firm to another and be successful.
mm,
They were successful at Merrill Lynch or they were successful at Goldman Sachs, but when they
mm,
moved, they weren't successful. But when he dug a bit deeper, he found men weren't able to be successful,
mm.
but women were. Women were able to successfully move from one organization to the next. And he wanted
Right.
to understand, why is that the case?
Mm,
Well, what he found is that women, because they were left out of the organizational power structure within their own organization, so a constraint,
mm.
they had to build a network outside of Merrill Lynch. They had to build a network outside of Goldman Sachs.
Correct.
So their network was much larger. They played where other people weren't playing. And so when they changed firms, because their network was far more expansive,
Mm.
women, were actually able to continue to be successful. So
Amazing.
it's a great example of playing where no one else is playing,
Mm,
of embracing your constraints
mm.
in order to be successful.
Fascinating. Thank you. So I have time for three more questions for you. My next question Whitney, is how do you see digital transformation? And
Mm,
with digital, I'm going to include generative AI, AR, AR, VR, and whatever else, the alphabets keep coming out in
mm,
digital. How do you see digital transformation influencing disruption and
mm,
leadership in organizations?
mm. Well, so the first thing is that obviously AR, VR, AI is disrupting us
Mm,
for sure. And I think something like VR and AR, we'll start there and then we'll go to AI. I think those are so exciting because part of changing and transforming, again, organizations don't disrupt, people do. So how are we going to disrupt ourselves?
mm,
Part of being able to disrupt our mindset is to be able to see things from a different perspective.
mm,
And something like VR can help us do that much more quickly. It can
mm.
put us into a situation, a
Yeah.
simulation that allow us to practice what we're trying to practice. So, for example, just this last weekend, I went rappelling off a
Mm,
cliff for the
mm,
first time. And I was
mm,
thinking, if I could have put myself into a VR situation and practiced that 10 times,
mm,
then I could get better a lot faster than I could by just doing it the first time, which
mm,
was
mm,
thrilling and terrifying all at once.
mm,
So that's that. AI, what I would say is I think AI, from a personal development standpoint,
mm,
is absolutely thrilling.
mm,
Now, you can use AI to cheat, right? I'm just going to have it punch something out for me and move on that. But that's not how it's meant to be
mm.
used. That's not it at its
Yeah.
finest. It's I need to have this conversation with someone. I need
Mm,
to give them feedback, and I'm not
correct.
sure quite how to deliver this.
Mm,
Here's what I want to say. Can you help me say it better? Can you
mm.
help me say it more impactfully? And
Yeah.
can you help me to figure out how to do this in
Mm,
5 minutes instead of 50 minutes? And
correct.
so when I think about AI and the power it has to help us disrupt ourselves, it can help us 10x who we are
Mm,
and
absolutely.
10x who we want to be.
Mm,
And that to me, if we can do it for ourselves, then that means we can do it for our organizations. And
mm,
to me, yes, I know there are all sorts of concerns. We've
mm,
got to deal with those.
mm.
But the fundamental thing that it can do to help us progress as human beings is absolutely thrilling to me.
Fantastic. What a great response. Thank you. Two more questions. My next question is based on all the research and work that you're doing, where do you see the biggest opportunities for disruption in the next few years?
Mm. Well, because I am so focused, I'm going to give you a little bit of a similar answer to what I just shared with you. Because I'm so focused on the idea of organizations don't disrupt, people do.
Mm,
I'm not focused on an industry per se. So
mhm.
what I would say to you is I think the biggest opportunities for disruption are across a broad array of
Okay.
industries,
Mm,
provided that the people within those industries and the people within those companies are doing this growth that you and I are talking about right now. We are disrupting ourselves and we are figuring out, okay, I've been growing about this fast, this over one, up one, over one, up one on the graph paper of my existence
mm,
fast. How am I going to use technology? How am I going to use these tools? How am I going to be committed to getting better even faster?
mm.
Because if I will do that, then I can disrupt my industry. So I think the biggest opportunity is for us as human beings
Well said.
in the next 10 years.
Well said. And disrupt ourselves.
Mhm.
Well said. And my last question, Whitney, and I want to talk to you about the book which you have just behind you, Smart Growth. We don't have time to get into details, but tell me a little bit about the book and then we'll speak about it some other time.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things that came up, Ash, as I had written the book Disrupt Yourself and Build an A Team, is that I was using this S curve and talking about personal growth.
Mm,
And I had a colleague say to me, Whitney, you make these vast intuitive leaps. And I'm like, yes, I do, which
mm,
I love because I think that means that for me and my brain, there's a higher power that's giving me these ideas.
mm,
But some people are like, we don't like vast intuitive leaps. I need research and data to back up what you've said, apart from the
mm,
qualitative. And so this book, Smart Growth, was really meant to be a way to describe the process of growth, what it looks like, what it feels like. Because if you understand it, if you can get smart about it, then you can do it faster. And so I wanted to take the qualitative experience, but then look at neuroscience, look at biology, all of these different disciplines to be able to say, this is a great framework for you to think about what growth looks like. And if you understand that, the more you understand a process, the more you can do it better. So it's a book meant to give you and I, as I said earlier, a way to demystify the process of change, a way to map out the way to understand what that looks like. We're going to be able to make progress faster.
Well said. And on that note, Whitney, I just want to say thank you so much for speaking to me about disruption, about your journey. I think I learned some very, very interesting new points from you on disruption. Thank you for the 7 accelerants, and for our viewers and listeners, let me repeat them. Take the right kind of risk, play to your strengths, embrace your constraints, examine expectations, step back to slingshot forward, leverage failure, and be driven by discovery. Thank you also for speaking to me about your forthcoming or your book, Smart Growth, and so many different aspects of what we can possibly look at in our own lives as we disrupt not just ourselves, but the businesses that we work in. I wish I had more time to keep talking to you, but I will reach out to you for another conversation in a few months' time. Thank you again, and good luck.
Thank you, Ash, for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for The Brand Called You.